Introduction to the Ghastly Journal. Welcome back to the Ghastly Journal, where our mission is to unearth the darkness that festers just beneath the surface of ordinary life. We do not sensationalize, we expose. We shine a light on the crevices where evil hides behind polite smiles, Sunday church attendance, and the illusion of familial love. What you are about to hear is not just another story of true crime. It is a reckoning. It is a confrontation with how far human beings can go when cloaked in social respectability and armed with resources, charm, and the blind trust of their community. Today, we descend into a tale that has haunted caseworkers, investigators, and survivors for nearly 3 decades. A story so carefully hidden that for years it existed only in whispers, in uneasy glances across church pews, in the cautious observations of those who couldn't quite name what felt wrong. This is the Macabre. History of the Foings, a couple whose carefully curated image as generous, devoted parents masked one of the most disturbing patterns of abuse and manipulation ever documented in a modern American town. Over the course of 15 years, Howard and Margaret Foing adopted 12 children, none of whom had verifiable birth certificates. The adoptions seemed like acts of compassion. They were applauded by neighbors, celebrated in local newsletters, even blessed by clergy. But what began as a tale of charity soon unraveled into a chilling portrait of control ritual and psychological terror. Behind the lace curtains of a grand Victorian estate, the Foings operated a system so insidious, so calculated, that even seasoned federal agents were left shaken. What follows is not fiction. These are facts supported by documents, interviews, and first-hand accounts from those who lived it, investigated it, and in some cases, barely survived it. Some names have been changed for privacy, but the story is real. And the echoes of its horrors are still felt today. Before we begin, we ask you to do 2 things first. Subscribe to the Ghastly Journal if you haven't already. Our investigations depend on people like you, curious, brave, and unwilling to look away. Second, prepare yourself. What you're about to hear will make you question how well you really know the people around you, especially those who seem perfect. Millbrook, a place where darkness shouldn't exist. To truly understand the horror of what happened inside the Foing household, one must first understand where it happened. Millbrook, Pennsylvania population 2962 is not the sort of place that headlines are made from. It's the kind of town where nothing happens, and that's exactly how its residents like it. Tucked among the rolling green hills of western Pennsylvania, Millbrook is a picture of Americana. White picket fences, corner diners where waitresses remember your coffee order, and neighbors who still shovel each other's driveways after snowstorms. Community potlucks, high school football, and church picnics serve as the social backbone of this sleepy township. News travels fast here, not through newspapers or television, but over cups of coffee at the local diner and whispered conversations in grocery store aisles. Children ride bikes without fear. Front doors are left unlocked. And when someone falls ill, casseroles appear on their porch as if summoned by instinct. It is precisely this sense of comfort and familiarity that made Millbrook such fertile ground for deception. Because in towns like this, people want to believe the best in one another. Suspicion feels like betrayal. Raising questions can be interpreted as being unneighborly, even cruel. That trust, that small-town refusal to consider that something deeply wrong could be happening right next door. is what allowed the truth about the Foings to remain hidden for so long. This is a place where respectability carries weight. Appearances matter, and Howard and Margaret Foing knew that. They knew how to blend in, how to appear not just normal, but exceptional. They didn't simply live in Millbrook, they became one of its most admired families. They attended church-supported local causes and smiled graciously at neighbors. And for years, no one dared look beyond that surface. But surfaces can be deceiving, and beneath Millbrook's postcard charm, a sickness had taken root in the grand old house on Elm Street, one that would remain undetected until it was too late for some. The arrival of the Foings. 1978. It was the spring of 1978 when the Foings arrived in Millbrook, their presence marked not by fanfare, but by a sense of quiet ambition. They purchased the Elm Street mansion, a sprawling, time-worn Victorian estate that had stood empty for nearly a decade. Locals had long referred to it as the haunted house on the hill, more out of habit than belief, its shuttered windows and vine-choked verandas evoking childhood dares and ghost stories. No one had expected anyone to buy it, let alone renovate it. And yet within weeks, a team of contractors descended, and the transformation began. Howard Foing, a polished investment banker from Pittsburgh, was rarely seen without a tailored suit, even when walking the family dog or retrieving the mail. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making things happen, someone for whom money had always opened doors. Margaret, his wife, was more enigmatic. A former pediatric nurse, she moved with practiced grace, her voice rarely rising above a soft, steady tone. Neighbors found her charming if a bit aloof, but her eyes, sharp assessing alert, left some with the feeling that she was always listening. They told the community they had moved to Millbrook for peace, for the fresh air, for a chance to build a home where they could finally settle. And the town embraced them. After all, who else would take the time, effort, and expense to rescue a decaying relic of Millbrook's history and breathe life into it again? The renovations were meticulous. Period-appropriate fixtures were restored. The gardens, once wild with neglect, bloomed again. Locals would pause during walks just to admire the transformation. Soon the house was no longer whispered about in hushed tones, it became a symbol of renewal. And the Foings, the kind of couple everyone hoped might invite them in for wine and polite conversation. No one could have imagined then that the restoration of that house also marked the beginning of something far more sinister. That within its lovingly repainted walls, a slow and methodical system of control and cruelty would begin to take root, hidden in plain sight behind oak doors and smiling greetings. Howard and Margaret Foing, the picture of elegance. From the very beginning, Howard and Margaret Foing seemed to possess an effortless grace that captivated Millbrook's small-town sensibilities. They weren't just new residents, they were aspirational figures. Howard's presence, tall and composed, exuded professionalism and command. He was always impeccably dressed, even on mundane mornings, wearing ironed slacks and crisp shirts, just to retrieve the newspaper. Some said he reminded them of a senator, others of a man born to be admired. Margaret, on the other hand, floated like an apparition, elegant but distant, poised but unknowable. Her voice, barely above a whisper, carried a kind of calm that soothed even as it unsettled. Elaine Winters, who lived across the street from the Foings for 2 decades, remembered her first impression vividly. They seemed like a couple out of a magazine, she said in an interview years later. Howard with his leather briefcase and Margaret with her pearl necklaces and garden gloves. You'd see them walking together every Sunday morning before church, and they looked like they had it all figured out. Margaret had a particular affinity for tending her roses, though neighbors often noted she also cared obsessively for a vine that clung to the back trellis, one that curiously never bore any flowers or fruit. She spoke of it often as if it were a child, struggling to bloom, and clipped it daily with the precision of a surgeon. These details felt quaint at the time, harmless eccentricities. Only in hindsight would they begin to appear as signals of something deeper. They hosted the occasional dinner party for the church elders, donated generously to the local hospital's pediatric wing, and participated in charity auctions for the Millbrook Elementary School, even before they had children. Margaret would bake her famous vanilla almond scones, while Howard quietly wrote checks with more zeros than most residents made in a year. Their goodwill became a shield, their grace a disguise. No one questioned them. No one had reason to. The Foings weren't just liked, they were trusted. And trust in Millbrook was more than social currency. It was armor. Margaret became something of an aspirational figure among the women of the neighborhood, mysterious, refined, and patient. She had a way of speaking to others that made them feel seen, even if only briefly. And yet the same women who admired her couldn't help but admit later that they never truly knew her. It was this carefully crafted image, wealth-poised benevolence, that made it so difficult for anyone to believe or even imagine that something so profoundly wrong could be happening behind their ivy-covered walls. But as we would come to learn, the greater the elegance, the deeper the rot. The longing for parenthood beneath Margaret, Foing's serene composure and perfectly curated domestic life, lay a grief so profound that it cast a long shadow over every corner of her world. For all their wealth and sophistication, the Foings were missing something Margaret believed essential: a child. Friends and neighbors knew, or at least suspected, that Margaret had suffered through infertility. Though she never discussed it directly, her yearning was visible in the way she lingered at the church nursery, or how she would sit on the porch for hours, watching the neighborhood children ride bikes or chase fireflies in the dusky Pennsylvania evenings. She had this look about her, Elaine Winters said, like she was holding something fragile inside and didn't dare breathe too deeply for fear it would shatter. Margaret's background as a pediatric nurse only deepened the ache. She had dedicated years of her life to tending to infants in their most vulnerable moments, holding newborns as they took their first breath, and sometimes their last. But none of those babies were hers. She had given so much of herself to the children of others, and still her arms remained empty. Howard, for his part, appeared less affected. He buried himself in his work, often commuting to Pittsburgh during the week and returning home only on weekends. His absence created a vacuum. Margaret, filled with routines and rituals, her gardening, her meticulous cleaning, her late-night baking. Neighbors would sometimes see lights on in the kitchen well past midnight. She was trying to fill the silence, Winters said, trying to drown out the ache. There were rumors that the couple had tried various fertility treatments, even traveled out of state to consult with specialists. But no child came, and for Margaret, who had dreamed of a large family since childhood, the loss was not just physical, it was spiritual. She spoke often of destiny and divine will in passing conversation. Some chalked it up to her religious upbringing. Others sensed something more obsessive behind her soft-spoken words. When the Foings finally announced that they had adopted a baby boy in the summer of 1980, The town rejoiced with them. It felt like a long-awaited happy ending. A baby shower was organized overnight. Margaret's eyes sparkled with the light no one had ever seen in her before. The local church held a special blessing ceremony. Millbrook, in its collective good-heartedness, believed that love had finally filled the void. But longing, especially when it festers for years in silence, does not always give rise to tenderness. Sometimes it becomes something far darker, a hunger, a compulsion, a need so overwhelming that it distorts even the most sacred intentions. And Margaret, as we would later learn, had never simply wanted a child. She had wanted control. She had wanted to build something, not just a family, but a doctrine, a design. The adoption of James and the town's celebration. James Foing was introduced to Millbrook with all the pomp of a royal heir. The town, already fond of Howard and Margaret, embraced the adoption as if it were their own miracle. For a town of less than 3,000 people, milestones were community events, and this one felt personal. A potluck was organized within hours of the announcement. Banners were hung at the local church. Margaret, glowing and proud, brought James swaddled in blue fleece and cradled with reverence to his first Sunday service, where he was formally blessed by Pastor Williams. He was a beautiful baby, bright-eyed, responsive, and disarmingly serene. Margaret held him with such intense possessiveness that it became noticeable even amid the celebration. She wouldn't let anyone else touch him, recalled Clara Jenkins, a fellow churchgoer. Not even the pastor. When he reached out to take James during the blessing, she hesitated visibly. Her whole body tensed. It was Howard who whispered something in her ear to convince her. Even as she reluctantly handed the child over, Margaret hovered so close to the pastor that several people later commented on it. She was practically breathing down his neck, Jenkins said. It wasn't motherly protection. It was territorial, like she thought someone might steal him. At the time, this intense attachment was seen as endearing, even understandable. Margaret had waited so long after all. Who could blame her for being overprotective? But that moment, her frozen expression, the delay, the proximity, would later be re-examined under a far more sinister light. What had seemed like maternal devotion would come to look more like the first signal of a controlling force. The days that followed were filled with casseroles and congratulatory notes. Margaret wrote long thank-you letters on cream-colored stationery, each signed with love and gratitude from Margaret Howard and baby James. She was never seen without the baby at church, at the grocer, in her garden. And when someone even gently asked to hold him, the answer was always no. Looking back, it was clear James wasn't just a child. He was a symbol. A manifestation of Margaret's longing fulfilled, yes, but also the first stone in the foundation of something much darker. Something that would expand far beyond what anyone in Millbrook could imagine. First signs of control and obsession. At first glance, Margaret's fierce protectiveness over James was interpreted by neighbors as nothing more than the natural instincts of a woman who had long waited for motherhood. But as time passed, what had once seemed like a maternal bond began to manifest as something more rigid, more compulsive. It wasn't simply that she doted on him. It was that she refused to share him. He was always in her arms, never on the hip of a neighbor, never left in the church. Nursery never allowed even a moment of separation, unless absolutely unavoidable. There was a moment at the grocery store that stuck with me, said longtime Millbrook resident Patricia Hayes. Margaret was shopping with James in a stroller, and someone complimented the baby and reached to tickle his foot. She pulled the stroller away so fast you'd think it had been a threat. Her smile didn't falter, but her body language radiated possession. Not protection, possession. This behavior extended to Howard as well. Although he often appeared at ease and friendly with townspeople, he rarely held the child. At church, he stood beside Margaret, hands clasped behind his back, while she clutched James as though preparing for someone to rip him away. She wouldn't even allow the pastor to bless James without standing mere inches away, watching his every move. It was like she believed James was fragile, Jenkins said, but not in a medical sense, in a spiritual one. The most disturbing instance came during a gathering at the parsonage. A parishioner joked that with such a beautiful child, the Foings might consider having another. Margaret's face changed instantly. She didn't laugh. She didn't respond. She simply stared at the woman for a long moment, blinked once, and then turned away with James tucked tightly under her arm. Over time, these moments added up. No one dared say anything out loud. After all, Margaret was kind, polite, and generous. She brought food to funerals. She helped sew costumes for the Christmas pageant. But those who saw behind the curtain even briefly were left with a feeling they couldn't quite name. Something was too tight, too controlled, too carefully maintained. James, too, began to reflect this tension. Though sweet and responsive in his earliest months, by the time he was 3, he rarely spoke in public. His eyes darted between faces, especially when Margaret was nearby. He was obedient to the point of robotic, and his laugh, a sound neighbors had once admired, was seldom heard. That child was never out of line, said one Sunday school teacher, but not in a normal way. He was watchful, like he was always waiting for something. No one would have imagined then that Margaret's behavior toward James was not merely overprotection. It was the beginning of a pattern, a blueprint for how she would handle every child that followed. Total control, complete isolation, and a form of psychological dominance that would harden with every new addition to the family. A rapidly growing family. By the time James turned 2, the Foings made a quiet but significant announcement they had adopted again. This time, a baby girl they named Elizabeth. She was introduced to the community in much the same way James had been, but the fanfare was more muted. Still, the neighbors smiled. The pastor prayed. Margaret glowed. Another child meant joy, right? It meant hope. And then came Thomas, and Catherine, and William. By 1985, the Foings had 5 adopted children, all under the age of 6. Their family photo appeared in a local newspaper alongside a short feature praising their selfless generosity and Christian love. People were amazed, not only at how quickly they were able to adopt, but at how seemingly easy they made it look. Most families, even those with means, struggled through a slow, often invasive adoption process. But the Foings, they glided through it as if chosen. There were whispers, of course. How were they navigating the system so efficiently? Pennsylvania's adoption policies in the early 1980s were notoriously strict, especially for families wanting to adopt multiple children. But Howard's wealth opened doors. His network of legal and financial professionals could push through paperwork in record time. The Foings had connections, quiet ones, well-placed, and they knew how to use them. Detective Richard Cooper, who would later lead the investigation into the family, put it simply, no one wanted to question them. They were doing what we're told to admire, taking in children who needed homes. and they had the money and manners to back it up. Who in their right mind would doubt them? From the outside, the Foing household was the picture of domestic success. 5 children each dressed immaculately, each seemingly polite, silent, and obedient. Their property was pristine. Their manners were impeccable. The children accompanied their parents to church, to the farmer's market, even to charity functions, but always as a unit, always within a few feet of Margaret. Behind closed doors, however, the isolation had begun. The children didn't attend public school. Margaret insisted on homeschooling. They weren't enrolled in local sports leagues, nor did they play in the park. When neighbors suggested play dates, Margaret declined with a gentle smile and a long-winded excuse someone was ill, or they were taking a family trip, or the children had too much schoolwork. As the family grew, so too did the strangeness surrounding it. What had once felt admirable began to feel eerie. "I used to wave at them from my porch," said Patricia Hayes. But the kids never waved back. They didn't even react. It was like they didn't see me at all. Still, no one said anything. Not out loud. Not yet. The unusual speed of adoptions. Even in a town like Millbrook, where gossip often traveled faster than the local mail, few dared to openly speculate about the pace of the Foing's growing household. But behind closed doors, the murmurs grew louder with each new addition. 5 adoptions in less than 5 years. No visible interaction with adoption services. No wait lists. No visible interviews or social worker visits. It didn't add up. Normally, adopting just 1 child in Pennsylvania at that time could take over a year, especially for couples not working through the state foster system. Background checks, home studies, mandatory counseling sessions, each was a layer of bureaucracy designed to protect vulnerable children. For the Foings, however, the system seemed to bend around them. Applications were expedited. Interviews were minimal or waived altogether. Judges signed off on adoptions in weeks, not months. Part of the reason, as later investigations would reveal, was that the Foings seldom used the same agency twice. They worked across state lines, leveraging small, often struggling adoption organizations that operated under loose regulation. These agencies were easy to influence, particularly with well-dressed clients and generous donations. In some cases, Howard and Margaret even requested children with incomplete documentation, kids from unstable backgrounds, transient families, or closed international systems. They weren't adopting orphans, said Detective Cooper. They were targeting kids who were already falling through the cracks. Children who were unlikely to be traced. Children who wouldn't raise questions if they disappeared. But in 1985, no one in Millbrook knew any of that. They saw only a wealthy, God-fearing couple offering sanctuary to unwanted children. A local newspaper ran a headline that read, "Angels among us, the Foings, open their home." Once again. Margaret cut out the article and taped it to the inside of a kitchen cupboard. It was still there a decade later when investigators searched the home. And yet there were oddities that even the town's fondness couldn't fully ignore. Why didn't the children attend public school? Why were they never invited to birthday parties or town events? Why did none of them have visible medical records or vaccination histories or report cards? The answers, it seemed, were always delivered with grace and finality. Margaret would laugh softly, brush a strand of hair from her face, and speak of safety, of the importance of home-centered learning, of protecting children from worldly influences. And Howard, with his polished manner, would reinforce her words with confident charm. "We're just doing what we believe is best," he would say. "Every child deserves peace." And so the questions dissolved until they didn't. Isolation and homeschooling. While the rapid expansion of the Foing family raised quiet eyebrows in Millbrook, it was their children's absence from public life that stirred a deeper unease, though no one dared say it aloud. In a town where community was everything, where children ran between each other's yards and friendships began in shared sandboxes, the Foing children were phantoms, present but inaccessible, smiling but never speaking. Margaret explained it all in terms the town could understand and approve of. "We just believe in the strength of home," she told one church group, her voice soft, her eyes gentle. "Too many modern influences, too much chaos in public schools. Here we can give them what they really need." No one pressed her. Homeschooling, after all, wasn't unheard of. And with her background as a pediatric nurse, she seemed more than capable. But capable didn't mean harmless. Neighbors began to notice that the children were never seen playing outside without Margaret's presence. They didn't attend Sunday school. They didn't join Little League or Girl Scouts. Even when invited to birthday parties, Margaret declined on their behalf with syrupy excuses: a cold, a scheduling conflict, a family retreat. And over time, the invitations stopped. Inside the home, each child was kept on a strict and isolating routine. They ate meals in silence, were taught individually rather than as a group, and were discouraged from forming bonds with one another. According to later testimonies, they were forbidden from entering each other's bedrooms. Their bedrooms, though outwardly cheerful, were locked from the outside at night. Margaret kept the keys on a chain around her neck. "You could see it in their posture," said Susan Fletcher years later. "Always standing close together, always glancing sideways, always waiting for some cue from Margaret." There was no spontaneity, no laughter, only practiced politeness and mechanical obedience. Margaret used religion as both rationale and shield. "Obedience is godliness," she once told a church friend who asked if her children were allowed to play freely. "We raise them in a sacred order." That phrase, sacred order, would appear dozens of times in Margaret's journal, discovered years later. At the time, it simply sounded spiritual. Later, it would read like code. And Howard. He remained supportive but distant. While he publicly affirmed his wife's decisions, he spent most weekdays in Pittsburgh. The domestic environment was Margaret's domain, utterly controlled, entirely self-contained. From the outside, the Foing house still looked like a haven. Beautifully kept, always quiet. A perfect image. But from within it was something else entirely. A place where childhood was structured into stillness, where fear wore the face of discipline, and where obedience was confused for peace. The children who were never seen. Though Margaret spoke often of family values of sacred unity and spiritual connection, those who lived near the Foing house began to notice something chilling. The children were rarely, if ever, seen in public. And when they were, briefly, momentarily, it was only as a complete unit, never individually, never spontaneously, and never without one of the parents closely watching. I remember seeing them outside, just once said, "Millbrook resident Calvin Ross." It was after a Sunday service. They came out of the church in a straight line like little soldiers. No talking, no laughter. Just walked to the car, one after another, heads down. That single sighting became emblematic of how the Foing children move through the world, if they move through it at all. More often than not, they didn't. They didn't walk to school. They didn't attend the local fair. They didn't show up at the library or the town movie night. They weren't enrolled in sports or art classes. In a community where children's lives were public by default, the Foing kids were enigmas, and that absence in time grew louder than their presence ever had. Parents tried to arrange social opportunities. "I wanted my son to play with James," said Patricia Hayes. They were the same age. "I thought it would be good for both of them, but every time I suggested it, Margaret had a reason. James had a fever, or too much homework, or they were about to leave town." It got to the point where I stopped asking. Others shared similar experiences. Failed playdates, unanswered letters from their own children to the Foings, birthday invitations returned unopened. The Foing children were present in name only. When the children did appear, their demeanor unnerved people. They did not fidget. They did not whisper. They did not respond to other children calling their names. It was like they were rehearsed, one Sunday school teacher said, like they were living a script. Still, the town did what towns often do when confronted with discomfort that cannot be explained. It rationalized. Margaret and Howard were loving parents after all. Everyone said so. They were generous, involved, philanthropic. Perhaps the children were simply shy. Perhaps Margaret was overprotective. Perhaps there was nothing to worry about. But there was. And when the silence finally broke, it would reveal that this carefully cultivated invisibility wasn't accidental. It was the point. These children had not merely been hidden from the town. They had been hidden from the world. The incident that opened a crack, 1987. The house on Elm Street maintained its silence for nearly a decade. But in the summer of 1987, that silence cracked literally, with the sound of a child falling from a tree and the even more jarring silence that followed. Thomas Foing, age 9, had climbed a gnarled oak in the family's backyard and slipped, breaking his arm. A clean break could have been fixed easily. A trip to the ER cast a few weeks of healing. But that's not what happened. Despite her background in pediatric nursing, Margaret chose not to take Thomas to the hospital. Instead, she attempted to reset the bone herself, an act of hubris or delusion, or perhaps something darker. What followed was not healing, but deterioration. The break worsened into a compound fracture. The wound became infected. Thomas developed a dangerously high fever. Only then, when the child could no longer stand, when his breathing grew shallow and erratic, did Howard intervene. He drove Thomas to the Millbrook General Hospital, where Dr. Sarah Chen was on duty. The boy was in septic shock when he arrived. "We had to operate immediately," Dr. Chen recalled. There was nerve damage, pus in the tissue. His arm was barely salvageable. What struck Dr. Chen more than the physical condition was the boy's reaction. He didn't cry. "Not once," she said. "Not during intake, not during prep, not even when we moved the broken arm, and when I asked what happened, he looked at his father first. As if for permission, that glance told her everything." When Dr. Chen requested Thomas's medical records, she was told they didn't exist. Howard claimed a fire at a previous adoption agency had destroyed them. When she pushed further, he became defensive, even aggressive. He said he was transferring Thomas to another hospital. Said I was overstepping. But Chen didn't back down. She filed a report with Child Protective Services, citing medical neglect and psychological red flags. It was a brave act in a small town with powerful families. A caseworker named David Morris was assigned. He visited the Foing home, interviewed the parents. observed the children. 3 weeks later, the case was closed. There is no evidence of abuse or neglect, Morris's report read. The home is orderly. The children appear healthy. Mrs. Foing explained the decision to treat Thomas herself as a result of her medical background and a personal fear of hospitals due to trauma in her own youth. That was all it took. No follow-up, no deeper questions, no second visit. And so the case was filed. The town sighed with relief. The Foings continued their lives. Thomas's arm bore the scar of an infected fracture, but the house returned to quiet. As if nothing had happened, as if everything were normal. But the crack had formed, and no matter how carefully it was plastered over, the rot beneath had begun to seep through. Dr. Chen's alarming discovery. Though the child welfare system closed the case, Dr. Sarah Chen could not. Something about the encounter with Thomas Foing and his family had burrowed into her consciousness like a splinter. She had worked in pediatric medicine long enough to recognize the difference between fear and obedience. What she saw in Thomas that day and what she didn't see haunted her. The absence of tears, the hyper-awareness, the eerie calm of a child in pain who had already learned it was safer not to cry. In the days following Thomas's emergency surgery, Dr. Chen made several calls to regional child services, to the hospital's legal department, and even to a former classmate who worked for a state-level medical board. She wanted guidance, a second opinion, some validation that her instincts weren't just paranoia. But each conversation was met with a kind of institutional politeness that masked discomfort. They're a respected family. Sarah, one colleague, told her, "You have to be careful. These things can backfire." Even within the hospital, Dr. Chen noticed hesitation. Nurses whispered about the child's strange detachment. A social worker confided off the record that Howard Folling had already contacted the hospital administrator with a complaint about excessive scrutiny and discriminatory assumptions. The message was clear: let it go. But Dr. Chen couldn't. She had seen the state of Thomas's arm. She had watched Margaret hover at the hospital, not with maternal concern, but with the cold vigilance of someone guarding a secret. And she had felt the chill when Howard looked at her, not with fear, but with warning. The Foings weren't panicked parents. They were managers. They were calculating. When Dr. Chen reviewed the intake paperwork again, one detail stood out. All fields related to medical history were marked NA. There were no pediatrician names, no vaccination records, no notes from prior injuries or checkups. It was as if the child had appeared from nowhere. She documented her findings thoroughly. Though she lacked proof of abuse, she submitted an internal report flagging the family for future review, and filed a second concern with Child Protective Services, a more detailed urgent letter highlighting medical neglect and psychological red flags. But the result was the same. The caseworker's follow-up concluded the family was attentive, orderly, and religious. The file was closed again. Years later, when investigators reopened the Foing case, Dr. Chen's report would be unearthed like a buried artifact, one of the earliest documented warnings ignored like so many others. In interviews, she expressed lasting regret. "I didn't have enough to accuse them outright," she said. "But I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to make anyone else believe it." Child Protective Services fails to act. The official report filed by David Morris, the caseworker assigned to investigate Dr. Chen's concerns, reads like a textbook example of how systems fail the most vulnerable. 3 pages long, tidy and written in clinical detachment, the report describes a visit to the Foing home that seemed designed to confirm the very outcome Morris had likely assumed before he even stepped foot inside. The home was well maintained, Morris wrote. The parents were cooperative, articulate, and appeared emotionally invested in the well-being of their children. The child in question, Thomas, was observed reading quietly in a sunlit room, his arm in a sling, his demeanor calm. Morris made no mention of Thomas's reluctance to speak, nor the way Margaret had answered several of his questions on the boy's behalf. He recorded no signs of distress in the other children, though he reportedly spent only minutes with each. Margaret provided him with copies of Thomas's homeschool medical logs, handwritten in meticulous cursive and bearing no third-party verification. Howard reiterated the story about the fire at the adoption agency, an untraceable explanation that Morris accepted without question. Perhaps he was intimidated. The Foings were persuasive, their home pristine, their manners flawless. Margaret wore a soft green blouse and pearls, that day her voice trembling slightly as she described her lifelong fear of hospitals and how it had clouded her judgment when Thomas was injured. "I panicked," she said. "It was maternal instinct, not negligence." The words struck just the right chord, vulnerable, apologetic, maternal. Morris bought it. He concluded that while Margaret's decision to treat the broken arm herself was medically inadvisable, it did not meet the criteria for willful neglect. No signs of abuse were observed. The case, he wrote, did not warrant further action. 3 weeks after the report was submitted, the file was officially closed. No follow-ups were scheduled. No warning flags were added to the family's file. And within 6 months, the Foings had adopted again. Decades later, Morris, who declined formal interviews, was quoted anonymously in a journalistic exposé. "I didn't see what others are now claiming," he said. "They seemed like a good family. The kids looked fine. But looking fine, as Millbrook would come to learn, means very little when children are trained to appear that way. When silence is enforced, not just by fear, but by design. The Foings continue to expand their family. After the brief disruption of the Thomas incident, life at the Foing residence returned to its eerie normalcy. Church attendance resumed. The children appeared again in their usual coordinated outfits, silent, still expressionless. Neighbors, if they noticed the scar on Thomas's arm or the thinness of his smile, didn't speak of it. They had been reassured after all. The system had said everything was fine. And so when Howard and Margaret announced the arrival of 3 more adopted children between 1988 and 1990, Robert Ann and Henry Millbrook's residents responded with the expected mix of applause and awe. "How do they do it?" one parishioner said during a potluck. "I can barely manage 2 kids and they have 8 now." Margaret's reply was always the same, with faith, structure, and love. By 1990, the Foings were raising 8 children, all under the age of 12. Their home had expanded to accommodate them, an upstairs wing renovated into additional bedrooms, a rear addition labeled a schoolroom by Margaret, complete with chalkboards and a child-sized lectern. The children were now even more invisible than before. Patricia Hayes noticed it. "I used to see James in the garden even if he didn't play. But now, nothing. I never saw them anymore. Not even in the windows." Despite, or perhaps because of their growing family, the Foings doubled down on their isolation. The children's appearances at church became rarer. When they did attend, They sat in a perfect row, hands on laps, eyes forward. They didn't act like siblings, said Elaine Winter. They acted like choir boys awaiting inspection. Margaret claimed it was simply a matter of discipline. Children thrive under structure, she said with a smile. But structure had become doctrine. Silence had become policy. And somewhere within the walls of that meticulously restored house, something was growing, something not quite visible, but palpable to anyone who dared look too closely. The Foings had become untouchable. Generous donors to local causes, Howard now sitting on the boards of 2 regional charities, Margaret co-hosting church luncheons. They had become Millbrook's saints. And saints, as the town would learn far too late, are rarely questioned until they fall. The whispering begins. By the early 1990s, the Foing family had reached a point of curious saturation. 11 children, all formally adopted, all living within the towering Victorian on Elm Street. While the town had grown used to Margaret's peculiar boundaries and Howard's strategic aloofness, a quiet dissonance had begun to ripple beneath Millbrook's pleasant surface. The number of children alone was remarkable, but it was the sameness of them that began to gnaw at those paying close attention. They all had that same look, said parishioner Clara Jenkins, not just their matching clothes, but their eyes. Blank, like the lights were on, but nobody was home. At church, the Foing children sat in perfect silence, no fidgeting, no yawning, no whispered jokes. Even the youngest sat with back straight hands, folded eyes fixed ahead. To some it was impressive, to others it was unnatural. "Children don't behave like that," said one retired school teacher. "Not unless they're trained to, or afraid to." These observations weren't shouted from rooftops. They trickled, hesitated, changed subject mid-sentence. After all, the Foings were still major donors to local programs. Howard had recently sponsored renovations at the community rec center, and Margaret had spearheaded a food drive. Their kindness, their wealth, their supposed saintliness, these things bought more than goodwill. They bought silence, and yet the questions remained. How were they adopting so many children so quickly? Why did none of the children attend public school? Why were there no birthday parties, no school photos, no neighborhood friendships? A few families made quiet efforts to investigate. One couple attempted to look up adoption records, but found only sealed files. Another family tried to befriend the Foings, inviting them to a barbecue. Margaret declined, citing a family retreat. Someone even wrote an anonymous letter to the county suggesting a follow-up welfare check, but nothing came of it. It was as though the Foings existed inside a fortress, not just of their home, but of their image. And that fortress had been built so high, so carefully, that even concern could not breach it. Still the whispers continued. At church, in the pews, at the post office, in the quiet pauses of PTA meetings. There was something wrong on Elm Street. People just couldn't agree on what it was, and no one not yet was brave enough to look too closely. The Fletchers, moving the Foings, might have continued their carefully managed façade indefinitely, if not for a single development that would change everything, the arrival of a new family just a few doors down. In the winter of 1992, Michael and Susan Fletcher moved to Millbrook with their teenage daughter, Emily. Michael had accepted a position as a journalist at the Millbrook Gazette, while Susan, a seasoned social worker, had recently taken a sabbatical following years working on child welfare cases in larger cities. The family bought a modest colonial on the same street as the Foings, drawn in by Millbrook's charm and supposed safety. They were different from the start, said Elaine Winters. Open, curious. You could tell they weren't afraid to ask questions. And Susan in particular noticed things that others had long dismissed. During her first encounter with the Foings at a church service, she turned to her husband and whispered, "Those children flinch." She hadn't meant it metaphorically. She had seen it with her trained eye, the way one child jerked ever so slightly when Margaret turned to speak, the way they avoided eye contact, the rigid posture that looked less like discipline and more like survival. Susan began to observe. Not professionally, not yet. Just as a neighbor, a mother, a woman who had seen too many broken children in her lifetime to mistake those signs. She noticed how the Foing children walked always in pairs, never more, never alone. How they seemed to check Margaret's face before reacting to anything. How their expressions vanished the moment they stepped outside their gate. They didn't behave like siblings, she would later say. They behaved like prisoners who had learned the language of captivity. Her daughter Emily, then a perceptive teenager, noticed it too. I remember trying to smile at one of the girls once, she said. She looked at me for half a second, and then her face just closed, like she wasn't allowed to look back. Susan kept her observations to herself at first, but slowly, methodically, she began to document them. What she didn't yet know, what no one could have known, was that the horror behind the walls of the Foing house ran deeper than she imagined. And soon, she would be the one to light the match that would burn their secret world to the ground. Early observations from Susan Fletcher. As winter thawed into spring, Susan Fletcher deepened her silent investigation into the Foing household. Her training in trauma response had honed her ability to spot signs. Others missed tremors in body language, rehearsed speech patterns, the kind of compliance that doesn't come from good parenting, but from fear. She began jotting notes in a small leather journal she kept by her bedside. Child for 3, male. Limps, slightly, possibly untreated injury. All children glance toward Margaret before speaking if they speak. No visible bruises, no friends, no school materials. Her entries were clinical but laced with growing concern. Susan attempted casual interaction. She invited Margaret for coffee, extended offers to help with groceries, even suggested their children might benefit from a shared art class. Margaret was polite but evasive. She accepted one coffee date, then rescheduled twice. When they finally sat down at a local cafe, Margaret's responses were vague, almost robotic. "Structure is important," she repeated. "We believe in sacred rhythms. Too much outside influence breaks things." Susan pressed gently. "But don't you worry. They might miss out on friendships." On normal childhood things, Margaret smiled in a way that felt unnatural. "Normal is a construct," she said. "We prefer to raise them in truth." Later that night, Susan wrote, "There is doctrine here. Not religion, not parenting. Doctrine. Her words are practiced. The children are trained." Susan's instincts were sharpening. Something was deeply wrong. But she also knew how fragile accusations could be, how easily people dismissed warnings, especially about families who looked on the surface like saints. Still, she persisted. She continued her observations, began trying to build rapport, looked for patterns. And then, one quiet afternoon, while visiting the Foing home, she heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. From behind a locked door on the 3rd floor came the unmistakable sound of shuffling, and then a muffled sob, The locked door and the crying sound. Susan Fletcher had only been inside the Foing house a handful of times, each occasion carefully orchestrated by Margaret. The rooms she was shown were immaculate, like something from a staged magazine spread. The furniture matched the windows, gleamed, and soft music played from hidden speakers. But no matter how flawless the surfaces appeared, Susan's instincts told her that something beneath them was terribly wrong. It was during her third visit in the spring of 1993 that she heard it. Margaret had excused herself to retrieve a book she wanted to lend Susan. Left momentarily alone in the upstairs hallway, Susan's attention was drawn to a door at the end of the corridor, tall, narrow, and painted a shade darker than the others. It had no label, no sign of use. But it was locked, and from behind it came a sound that shattered the illusion of order Margaret had so carefully built. First, there was movement, a soft scuff of feet across wood. Then, a brief, barely audible gasp, and finally, a sob muffled but unmistakably the sound of a child trying to stifle pain. Susan froze. The sound was fleeting gone before it fully registered, but it chilled her nonetheless. Her heart pounded as she turned away, just in time for Margaret to reappear, book in hand, smile serene. "This one really changed how I see parenting," she said, handing over a dog-eared paperback titled Sacred Order, The Divine Family. Susan forced a smile. "Lovely," she murmured, though her mind was already spinning. Back at home, she recorded the incident in her journal. Third floor west-facing door. Locked, child behind it. Sounds of distress. Margaret returned before I could ask. She would later try to bring it up indirectly. Over coffee, she remarked, "You must have a lot of storage space in that old house." Margaret's eyes flickered just for a second. "Yes," she said. "It's important to keep the past out of sight." Susan pressed. "I thought I heard something last time I visited." Movement upstairs. "Do your kids ever sneak around up there?" Margaret laughed lightly. Old houses make strange noises, don't they? But Susan no longer believed that. She believed someone or several someones were being kept behind that door. Someone not listed among the Foing's 11 adopted children. Someone hidden. And once you hear a child cry from behind a locked door, you never forget the sound. The child in the window. A few weeks after hearing the sob from behind the third-floor door, Susan's suspicions deepened in a way that was impossible to dismiss. She was walking her dog along Elm Street one overcast morning when she felt the undeniable sensation of being watched. Glancing up toward the Foing house, she saw a pale face staring down at her from the third-floor window. The child, a girl, couldn't have been older than 10. Her hair was long and dark, her features sunken, her expression vacant. The moment their eyes met, the girl vanished, ducking from the window so abruptly it made Susan's breath catch in her throat. She froze, staring at the glass. The curtain shifted slightly, then stilled. No movement, no second glimpse. Susan rushed home, her heart racing. She had met all of the Foing children, every single one, and that girl was not among them. That evening she approached the subject as delicately as she could. She called Margaret under the pretense of delivering a thank you for a borrowed dish and asked casually, "Is Elizabeth growing her hair out again? I could have sworn I saw her in the third-floor window this morning." There was a pause. "Oh, maybe," Margaret replied. "They move around so much in that big house I lose track." But Susan wasn't convinced. She had spent enough time with the Foing children to know their faces, and that wasn't Elizabeth, or Catherine, or Anne. The girl she saw was someone else, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. She confided her discovery to her husband Michael that same night. He listened, grim-faced, nodding slowly. "It's not just you," he said. "I think something's going on. And I think I've been circling it in my own work without realizing it." That's when Susan learned about Michael's investigation into illegal adoption networks across the tri-state area. His newspaper series had begun innocuously, a human interest piece about children waiting for homes, but had gradually morphed into a disturbing deep dive. Agencies folding under suspicious circumstances, children placed without proper records, loopholes exploited, money exchanged discreetly. Susan's observations and Michael's research were beginning to intersect in terrifying ways, and yet, even as the evidence began to build, neither of them could have imagined the extent of what they were about to uncover. The timeline. Matches. Michael Fletcher's investigation into adoption fraud had started as a matter of professional curiosity. He had stumbled across references to defunct agencies while researching a feel-good article about successful adoptions. But the deeper he dug, the stranger the connections became. Paperwork was incomplete, background checks were bypassed. Whole case files had vanished when agencies shut down overnight. What began as coincidence slowly took shape as a pattern. And now, with Susan's growing unease about the Foing household, that pattern sharpened like a knife. One night, over a table littered with coffee mugs and red-inked articles, Michael pulled out a timeline he had been building. It listed shuttered adoption agencies and the approximate dates they ceased operation. Alongside that, he listed the known adoption dates of the Foing children. The overlaps were undeniable. "The first agency shut down in late 1980, he said, tapping the page. Same month, James was adopted. He continued down the list. Catherine adopted in 84, just 3 weeks after another small agency dissolved under scrutiny for record tampering. William adopted in 85, immediately following the closure of a placement service in Ohio, flagged for missing documentation." Michael looked at his wife. "I think the Foings were working with these agencies just before they collapsed. I think they were acquiring children through illegitimate channels." Susan's face paled. "And if those kids didn't have proper records, they'd be nearly impossible to trace," Michael finished. The implications were staggering. These weren't simply adoptions. They could be acquisitions carefully planned, legally obscured, and potentially exploitative. And if that were true, then the girl Susan had seen in the third-floor window, unfamiliar, unseen, unacknowledged, was not just an anomaly. She was a missing child. That realization changed everything, because it meant the Foings weren't just hiding trauma. They might be hiding crimes. The 12th and 13th children. Shortly after Michael and Susan Fletcher began connecting the dots between illegal adoptions and the Foing timeline, the couple made a public announcement that sent another ripple through the community. Margaret and Howard were adopting again, not one child, 3. Twin boys, Peter and Paul, and a girl named Mary. That brought the total to 11 children officially documented in the Foing household, though Susan now suspected the real number was higher. The public story was simple. The children were special needs cases from an out-of-state agency, and the Foings, with their experience and resources, had been chosen to take them in. The church offered its usual blessing. A few families brought over gifts. But the whispers grew louder. These adoptions happened just as Michael's articles on adoption fraud were hitting the stands. It was too well timed to be coincidence. It felt like a response, he later said, like they were reasserting their narrative. Look at us, we're the saviors. And yet it wasn't just the speed of these new adoptions that disturbed the Fletchers. It was the way the children appeared in public only once at a church event weeks after their supposed arrival. They were pale, thin, and unlike the earlier Foing children who at least mimicked normalcy, these new three looked broken. Their eyes remained locked on Margaret. They didn't speak. They flinched when touched. They weren't being integrated, Susan observed. They were being absorbed. Behind the scenes, the couple worked with Detective Richard Cooper, then still a junior officer. Susan had quietly passed him her growing journal of observations. Michael shared the adoption timelines. Together they created a profile that suggested something far more sinister than a controlling household. This wasn't just neglect. It might not even be just abuse. It was beginning to look like a system, a ritual. And the question no one dared say aloud, what were the Foings doing with all these children? A network of loopholes and ghost children. The deeper Cooper dug into the records, the more troubling the findings became. Most adoption records were sealed, but those that weren't revealed a disturbing consistency. The Foings had worked with at least 5 different agencies in 3 different states. Each agency closed or faced scrutiny shortly after finalizing one or more Foing adoptions. Each had gaps in documentation, missing birth records, unverifiable foster histories, untraceable prior residences. In legal terms, the children were placed. In practice, they were ghosts. Every time they adopted, they made a large donation, Cooper said. Not illegal technically, but suspicious. These weren't standard adoption fees. They were financial contributions to agencies on the brink of collapse, payments that in retrospect seemed more like bribes than donations. The pattern was chilling in its precision. Howard's wealth wasn't just a shield, it was a weapon. The Foings would use a legitimate agency just long enough to get what they wanted, then disappear as the agency imploded under legal pressure. Each adoption left behind a thinner paper trail than the last. Some children had no social security numbers, no immunization records, no traceable medical history. This was intentional. They were selecting children from the margins, said Cooper. Foster kids, undocumented children, kids from families too poor or chaotic to follow up. Kids whose disappearances wouldn't make the front page. The children weren't adopted in the traditional sense. They were absorbed into the Foing system, reclassified, renamed, reshaped. And for at least 3 of them, Susan now believed, never even recorded. One of them had looked her straight in the eye from the 3rd-floor window. The others, she feared, hadn't been seen at all. The motive, love control, or something worse. On the surface, Margaret Foing's motive appeared deceptively simple. She'd always wanted a large family. She had been unable to conceive. She came from a religious background. She wanted to heal through motherhood. That's the story she told. And for a time it seemed believable. Even Susan in her early notes allowed for the possibility that Margaret's rigidity stemmed from grief, distorted, but rooted in love. But that illusion began to unravel with one small detail. During a visit, Susan saw Margaret not as a mother, but as a monarch. She stood at the top of the staircase, giving orders with a tone that was not angry, not loud, but final. The children obeyed instantly. They moved as though choreographed. The house wasn't a home. It was a theater, and Margaret was its playwright. She didn't want a family, Susan later wrote. She wanted subjects. Cooper agreed. It wasn't about love, he said. It was about control. Still, that explanation only scratched the surface. Why go to such length? Why adopt so many children with incomplete records? Why the secrecy? The locked rooms, the third-floor shadows. There were hints, strange phrases Margaret used in passing purity, through structure, cleansing the seed, sacred discipline. Terms that felt spiritual but weren't rooted in any mainstream religion. Margaret had created something else, entirely her own belief system. A hybrid theology made of fragments, Christian overtones, esoteric rituals, and something she never spoke of directly, but always acted out, an obsession with purification. The children weren't just there to be loved, they were there to be reshaped, cleansed, corrected, and for some of them, sacrificed. Susan's terminal warning. In the spring of 1995, everything changed. Susan Fletcher had been quietly building a case, an unofficial one, but painstaking in its detail. Her health, however, had begun to deteriorate rapidly. Diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer in late 1994, she spent her final months confined to her home under hospice care, growing weaker each day, but refusing to surrender her mission. She knew she was running out of time. From her bed, Susan summoned Detective Richard Cooper one evening. He arrived expecting little more than a goodbye. What he received was a dossier unlike anything he had ever seen. She'd kept it all, Cooper recalled. Every observation, every oddity, notes on each child, maps of the house, photographs taken discreetly of the third-floor window, even transcripts of conversations she'd had with Margaret. The file was thick, hundreds of pages organized with tabs and annotations. Susan had included not only her personal notes, but clippings from Michael's investigative work, timelines of adoption dates, hand-drawn schematics of the Foing home layout, and a growing list of questions with no answers. In her frail voice, she made Cooper promise something, that he would look into it after she was gone, that he wouldn't let the image of the perfect family stand unchallenged, that he would give a voice to the children who couldn't speak. She didn't sound afraid, Cooper said. She sounded angry, determined. Susan died on June 12, 1995. Her funeral was attended by dozens in the community who remembered her as a warm, curious, and compassionate woman. Only Cooper knew the extent of what she'd uncovered, and in that knowledge he felt a quiet fire kindle within him. He began reviewing the file in secret. By day, he fulfilled his duties. By night, he returned to the Fletchers' quiet house, sifting through page after page, slowly assembling a picture of something deeply calculated. The deeper I went, he said, the more I realized this wasn't just one family's dysfunction. This was something ritualistic, systematic. And with Susan's words still ringing in his ears, "Don't let them bury this with me." Cooper took the first irreversible step. He began investigating the Foings. Cooper's quiet pursuit of the truth. Detective Richard Cooper knew he was treading on dangerous ground. Millbrook was small, insular, and deeply deferential to the Foings. Howard had friends on the town council. He donated to the police department's youth outreach fund. He shook hands with the mayor. Accusing them of wrongdoing would be more than controversial. It would be professional suicide. So Cooper worked in silence. He started by reviewing property deeds and tax records. The Foings had made significant renovations to their home, most notably in the upstairs wing. Permits filed in 1984 referenced soundproofing adjustments and reinforced interior locking mechanisms. Strange for a family home. Then there were the trust funds. Cooper discovered that Howard had established a trust account for each of the 11 adopted children. On the surface, it looked generous, but the fine print told another story. Funds would only be released once the child reached age 25 and had maintained continuous contact with their adoptive parents. More troubling still, one clause explicitly prohibited any efforts to uncover biological family history. Any such attempt would result in forfeiture of the fund. It wasn't about money, Cooper would later say. It was about control. Ownership. He began driving by the house at odd hours, logging who entered and who left. He tried speaking to former tutors, delivery drivers, and even gardeners who'd worked briefly for the Foings. Most said little. Some had moved away. A few seemed scared. The breakthrough came when he tracked down Maria Vasquez, a former housekeeper who had disappeared from Millbrook in 1991. She was living in Ohio under her maiden name. At first she refused to talk, but when Cooper showed her Susan Fletcher's journal, the photographs, the notations, the names, Maria began to cry. So someone else saw, she whispered. Someone else heard the voices. And then she started to speak. Maria Vasquez breaks the silence. Maria Vasquez had worked with the Foings for 6 months in 1991. She had responded to a job listing for a live-in housekeeper and was drawn by the salary, which was generous. The interview was brief. Margaret liked her immediately. She said I was quiet, Maria remembered. Said I had the kind of silence she needed. The house was always too quiet. Maria had grown up in a loud, loving family in New Jersey where even the clatter of dinner plates carried warmth. But at the Foings, silence felt suffocating. The children were polite but distant. They never spoke unless spoken to. They never laughed. They never cried. Each child had their own room, Maria said. That seemed normal. But they weren't allowed in each other's rooms. Ever. At night, Margaret would walk the hallways. Maria could hear the creak of the floorboards outside her door. One night, she followed the sound and saw Margaret slipping food trays through narrow slots at the base of 3 locked doors on the 3rd floor. I asked her once, Maria said. She said those rooms were for children with special needs, children who required isolation. I wanted to believe her, but she trailed off. You could hear them, she said at last, whispers, soft crying, one night singing. It didn't sound like play, it sounded like survival. She was forbidden from entering the 3rd floor without permission. Once she tried, the door was locked. The next day, Margaret told her without a hint of anger, curiosity is the seed of betrayal. What finally pushed Maria to flee was an incident with James, the oldest child. One night during dinner, James spoke out of turn. Margaret ordered him to stand in the corner. All night Maria whispered. She checked on him every hour, made sure he hadn't moved. I heard her telling him the sin had returned. That night, Maria packed her things and slipped out before sunrise. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't even return to collect her final paycheck. I was scared, she admitted, not just of them, but of what they were becoming. Cooper left that interview with shaking hands and the confirmation he needed. The horror in Susan Fletcher's notes wasn't theory. It was real. And it had names. The locked rooms on the 3rd floor with Maria Vasquez's chilling testimony in hand. Cooper returned to Millbrook carrying a private storm of urgency and dread. Her words had confirmed the darkest of Susan Fletcher's suspicions. The locked doors on the third floor weren't symbolic, they were cells. And the children inside them weren't under special medical care. They were prisoners. Maria's account detailed 3 identical rooms, always locked, each one furnished with nothing but a mattress and a slot at the bottom of the door just large enough for a tray. No books, no toys, no conversation, only food and silence. Margaret had told Maria the children upstairs were spiritually compromised, that they required segregation for their own safety, but even that vague justification crumbled under scrutiny. They weren't being protected, Maria had said. They were being erased. The structure of the house itself seemed to have been altered to accommodate these secret quarters. When Cooper reviewed old blueprints from the county office, he found a mismatch. The original Victorian design showed a single attic space on the third floor meant for storage, but a renovation permit filed in 1984 detailed a habitable reconfiguration of that space. The plans had no specific labels, just blank rooms, locked behind reinforced doors. Cooper now understood the fear that clung to every whispered warning. The Foings hadn't just adopted children, they'd sorted them, divided them, controlled them, and above all, they had hidden them. With this new knowledge, Cooper began the delicate process of escalating the investigation quietly. He couldn't go to Chief Wallace. The man had already dismissed previous concerns, and Howard Foing's political influence ran deep. Cooper needed outside help. He contacted Lisa Harper, a former Academy colleague now working with the Pennsylvania State Police Child Exploitation Task Force. When he handed her the dossier, including Susan's journal, Maria's statement, and his own findings, Harper didn't hesitate. "We need a warrant," she said. The clock had started ticking. Bureaucratic resistance and secret surveillance. Though Harper believed Cooper's findings acquiring a search warrant for the Foing residence proved maddeningly complex, Margaret and Howard were still considered model citizens, wealthy, philanthropic, well-connected. Judges were hesitant. Local officials dragged their feet. Cooper's own department warned him not to cause embarrassment to the town, but Harper pressed on. Together, she and Cooper built the case day by day. Cooper began driving by the house at odd hours, logging every visible movement. He spoke to teachers who'd administered standardized tests to the Foing children, the few public interactions legally required by the state. One remembered the children as quiet, to the point of uncanny. Another recalled a child who didn't answer questions unless given nonverbal approval from Margaret. Cooper also tracked down former handymen and cleaners who had worked in the house briefly. None had lasted more than a few weeks. One claimed he had been told to avoid the third floor entirely. Another said Margaret would watch him clean wordlessly until he felt compelled to quit. And yet none of this was evidence in the eyes of the court. Suspicion wasn't proof. Neither were feelings whispers or gut instinct. What Cooper needed was irrefutable physical documentation. Harper advised patience but also urgency. "Once we make the move," she warned, "we have to hit fast and hard. If they get wind of this, they'll burn everything. Or worse." It was Michael and Susan Fletcher's daughter, Emily, who provided the final piece of the puzzle. Now 19 and studying journalism herself, Emily had quietly taken up her parents' mantle. She'd been combing missing children reports across the states where the Foings had adopted. In 3 cases, she found a disturbing pattern shortly after the Foings adopted a child. Another child in the same region went missing. Same towns, same months. No overlap in records. Cooper cross-referenced the names. Each missing child had never been found, and not one had a paper trail stronger than a half-page police report. It was enough. Connecting the missing to the house of God. The revelation that children had gone missing in the same regions and in the same time frames as the Foing adoptions cracked the case wide open. It was no longer a theory, no longer just a question of poor parenting or unusual behavior. It was now unmistakably a case of possible abduction. Emily's research revealed 3 names: Maria Gomez, age 9, last seen in a migrant camp outside Reading, Pennsylvania in 1981. Tyrell Washington, age 7, vanished from a housing project in Pittsburgh in 1985. Alexei Petro, age 8, disappeared from a Philadelphia suburb in 1990. All 3 children had been reported missing within 30 days of a confirmed Foing adoption. All were from marginalized communities, immigrant families, impoverished neighborhoods, vulnerable systems. Their cases had received little media coverage. Police follow-ups were limited. No bodies were found. And now Cooper believed he knew why. These children weren't simply lost, he said later. They were taken, quietly, strategically, disappeared into a house that looked like salvation. Each of the Foing adoptions during those years had come with a strange absence of formal documentation, birth certificates marked, pending Social Security numbers to be assigned. Harper confirmed that in several cases, the children were registered only under the Foing name with no traceable prior identity. Cooper realized something else chilling. While the redeemable children had names, trust funds, and even photographs, the ones suspected of being taken, the vessels had nothing. No paper trail, no trace. They were not only hidden, they were erased. Cooper and Harper now had what they needed to move forward. The warrant was signed on October 22, 1995. The raid would happen the next morning. The morning raid, October 23, 1995. The raid on the Foing residence began at 6:47 a.m. Unmarked vehicles lined the wooded stretch of Hawthorne Road just beyond visibility from the main street. The plan was simple: enter, fast secure the children, search the premises, and prevent Margaret or Howard from destroying evidence. Detective Cooper arrived in the lead car, flanked by agents from the state police and child welfare. They wore no insignia. The element of surprise was crucial. Behind them, 2 ambulances idled, just in case. No one knew exactly what they'd find inside. At 6:51 they knocked. No response. At 6:54 they breached. The house, already haunting in its quietness, became unnervingly still. The front door gave way with little resistance. Inside, the air was cool, scented faintly with lemon oil and something sterile like hospital-grade antiseptic. Cooper would later recall the silence as the kind that waits, not rests. Margaret was found in the kitchen, calm, barefoot, holding a ladle over a simmering pot of oats. She didn't scream, didn't question the intrusion. She looked up, gave Cooper a tight, unreadable smile, and said, "You're late." Howard was in his study, already shredding documents. It took 2 officers to restrain him. He shouted about privacy, legal overreach, and religious persecution. None of it mattered. The warrant was valid. What Cooper and the team found upstairs, however, would change the course of the case and the town forever. The second floor was, as expected, rows of neatly kept bedrooms. Children's belongings lined the shelves: books, clothes, notebooks with carefully copied scripture. But the third floor was another world entirely. Behind a bolted door, marked only with the Roman numeral 12, the team found 3 locked rooms. 2 were empty but bore signs of long-term habitation scratches. On the inside of the doors, food trays stacked neatly, the lingering scent of sweat and childhood fear. The third door wouldn't open. They had to use a crowbar. Inside, huddled in the corner, was a girl emaciated mute. Her arms crossed over her chest, blinking at the sudden light as if she hadn't seen it in weeks. She didn't know her name. She had never been to school. She hadn't spoken in years. The silence. After the sirens. In the hours that followed the raid, the town of Millbrook entered a kind of suspended animation. The news traveled fast, but not loudly. No reporters arrived that day. No press releases were issued. Everything felt held in breathless quiet. The children, those who were registered, were taken into protective custody. Each was evaluated by psychologists and child welfare officers. Some spoke easily, others said nothing. A few asked when they would be allowed to go home. But 3 children, 2 girls and 1 boy, remained unidentified. They had no birth certificates, no medical records, no documented adoptions. Nothing. "We called them the ghosts," one officer said. "They didn't just slip through the cracks. They'd been pushed." The mute girl found in the locked room was among them. She was estimated to be around 9 years old, though small for her age. The others were slightly older. None spoke of their time in the house. None could or would say where they came from. Their eyes were glassy, their limbs tense. When asked simple questions, they stared at their hands. Cooper returned to the house the following evening after the warrant had expired. The structure had already begun to rot in his mind, too clean, too symmetrical, too perfect. He stood in the third-floor hallway staring at the closed doors and felt something heavy settle in his chest. Those rooms weren't just about control, he said. They were about removal. Margaret wasn't raising children. She was unmaking them. Outside neighbors had begun to gather. Some came out of morbid curiosity. Others brought casseroles as if to ward off whatever evil might linger. The Foing house had always looked like a place of order. Now it looked like a mausoleum. The town turns inward. In the days after the raid, the town of Millbrook didn't explode in outrage. It imploded in shame. There was no public protest, no candlelit vigil. The community had after all admired the Foings, celebrated them, elected Howard to the zoning board, hosted baby showers for each new adoption. Their church pew had never gone empty. Now confronted with the truth, the town responded with quiet denial. Some residents claimed the whole thing was exaggerated media hysteria, they muttered, though no national outlets had yet touched the story. Others insisted the Foings must have meant well. Margaret was strict, yes, but godly. Some refused to speak at all. Pastor Green, once a close friend of the family, gave a brief, vaguely worded sermon about wolves in sheep's clothing, but mentioned no names. When asked afterward if he'd ever suspected anything, he simply said, "They always tithed on time." The children were distributed among temporary foster homes, while the state attempted to untangle the labyrinthine mess of their legal status. Those with documents were eventually relocated or placed with distant relatives. Those without identities remained under state care, labeled simply as unverified minors. No charges were immediately filed. Howard lawyered up within days. His legal team argued that the locked rooms were therapeutic enclosures for children with extreme behavioral conditions. Margaret was placed under psychiatric evaluation and deemed temporarily unfit for questioning. She spent the next several months in a private hospital just outside Albany. The case dragged. Paperwork was misfiled, key evidence misplaced, and while Cooper and Harper fought to maintain momentum, the machine of quiet, institutional decay did what it had always done. It buried the horror. Not with fire, but with silence. Margaret's treatment and the journal nobody claimed. While legal motions stalled and public interest quietly eroded, Margaret Foing became a ghost in her own story. Institutionalized at the Briarcliff Restorative Hospital, an upscale psychiatric facility known for discretion, Margaret was declared temporarily unfit to stand trial by court-appointed psychologists. Her behavior, they claimed, was dissociative and routinely non-responsive to rational inquiry. To the public, it looked like a retreat, but to Cooper, it felt like a tactic. She didn't snap, he later said. She stepped out as if rehearsing an exit she'd already prepared for. During her first 2 months in Briarcliff, Margaret reportedly spoke only once and only to her assigned social worker. The statement was short, cryptic, and would haunt investigators for years. They were never mine. I was just the fire. No one knew what she meant. But then, in January 1996, a Briarcliff janitor discovered something tucked behind a loose ceiling tile in Margaret's private suite. A journal bound in red cloth, brittle with age, its pages filled with strange, meticulous script. The entries were written in blocky, slanted handwriting. Some pages were simple inventories, dates, names, notes, like disobedient cleansed, returned to silence. Others were poetic, eerie verses about light hunger and the trial of the seed. Interspersed were prayers, though none matched Christian doctrine. One recurring phrase appeared dozens of times: "Blessed be the erasure, for it is clean." Authorities had no idea what to make of it. Some believed the journal was a personal theology, a hybrid cult philosophy born from Margaret's mental illness. Others thought it was a ledger of punishment. A few feared it was something even darker, a doctrine passed down. When Cooper reviewed the journal, he noted a pattern. Many of the children's names listed within, especially those marked with the symbol, matched the identities of the unregistered minors found in the house. Those children never spoke of the markings themselves. But when shown a copy of the symbol, one girl immediately turned pale and began crying. Margaret never acknowledged the journal. She died from cardiac arrest on April 2, 1996, still in Briarcliff, still officially unfit to stand trial. No funeral was held. Her body was cremated, and the journal sealed in an evidence box remains unclaimed. The trial of Howard Foing, with Margaret dead and the children dispersed. Howard Foing became the public face of a horror no one wanted to name. Though his defense team worked tirelessly to stall proceedings, the sheer volume of irregularities in the adoption records made it impossible to bury the case entirely. In September 1996, the trial began. The prosecution focused not on abuse too difficult to prove after so many years, but on fraud, obstruction, and unlawful adoption practices. Howard was charged with knowingly filing false adoption documents, engaging in financial transactions with unlicensed agencies, failing to report the presence of unregistered minors in his home, interfering with child protective services. What the court didn't address, however, was what horrified the town the most: the rooms, the punishments, the silence. Those accusations remained off the official record, explained away as disciplinary misjudgments or alternative parenting philosophy. The children, traumatized and scattered, were deemed too fragile to testify, and the journal deemed inadmissible. The defense called it an unverified artifact of an unstable mind. Still, the prosecution built a compelling paper trail. Emily Fletcher testified, her voice calm but biting. She recounted the missing children, the suspicious donation patterns, and her parents' growing dread. Her testimony brought several jurors to tears, but in the end, the verdict was anticlimactic. Howard Foing was convicted on 4 counts of adoption fraud and sentenced to 12 years in state prison. He served only 8. Released in 2004, he quietly relocated to a gated community in Connecticut, where he lived under the name Howard Raines. He died in 2011. No obituary was published. No relatives claimed his ashes. His estate was auctioned anonymously. But the house in Millbrook, that was another matter. The house that no one wanted. After the trial, the Foing residence on Hawthorne Road stood empty for nearly a decade. Overgrown vines curled around the eaves. Shutters sagged. A rusted swing set squeaked in the wind. The once manicured lawn turned wild, as if nature itself had grown repulsed by the place. Attempts to sell the house failed repeatedly. Buyers backed out mid-contract, realtors reported bad energy, and clients experiencing migraines or nausea upon entering the property. One agent quit after hearing what she described as the sound of a child breathing from behind the third-floor door, though the house was empty. Some townspeople wanted it demolished. Others argued for historical preservation, a perverse monument to what had happened. But no action was taken. The house became a wound the town ignored, driving past with eyes averted. Teenagers dared each other to break in. Urban legends flourished that the house still echoed with ghostly cries, that Margaret's voice could be heard whispering from the vents. One story claimed a boy disappeared after spending a night in the attic. His name scratched into the wall when police found his flashlight. Eventually, the town put up a gate. The property was condemned in 2009, but the house never collapsed. Even storms seemed to avoid it. Lightning would strike nearby trees, but never the roof. Snow would melt faster on the Foing lot than anywhere else on the block. And the third-floor windows, they remained dark, yet always reflective, as though something was still watching. The children, they couldn't trace. By the turn of the century, most of the adopted Foing children had either been placed in long-term care, fostered, or, where possible, returned to distant biological family. A few even reclaimed their birth names and quietly disappeared into adulthood, severing all ties to Millbrook and the history that nearly consumed them. But not all the children had names. 3 remained unidentified. Known only by the first names assigned to them by Margaret, Lily, Gideon, and Joy, they were believed to be between 7 and 10 years old when the raid occurred in 1995. They bore no documentation, had no prior school or medical records, and no DNA matches were found in any national databases. Their photographs were circulated through missing persons networks, but no one came forward. They had no memory of life outside the Foing house. Lily was the girl found in the locked room. She refused to speak for nearly a year. When she finally did, it was in whispers, as though each word had to be pulled through layers of something sticky and unseen. There was a bell, she told a therapist once. If it rang twice, you weren't allowed to sleep. Gideon displayed signs of deep dissociation. He often referred to himself in the third person and would panic when doors were closed too tightly. Joy, ironically named, was prone to night terrors, waking up with scratches on her arms she insisted were not self-inflicted. Each child remembered Margaret differently. To Lily, she was the Lady of Clean Hands. To Gideon, she was Mother 12. Joy only called her the one who sang behind the mirror. Therapists speculated that these weren't just metaphors or childish misremembrances. They might have been part of a system, a codified, methodical environment designed to fragment identity, suppress memory, and instill obedience through fear disguised as theology. Eventually, the state placed all 3 children under new identities and enrolled them in protected witness programs for minors, despite no formal charges pending. The logic was simple. They were the only surviving witnesses to whatever had truly happened inside that house, and someone somewhere might want their silence ensured. To this day, their whereabouts remain unknown. But every few years, a file crosses a caseworker's desk, an anonymous letter sent to the state archives containing a drawing, a phrase, or a journal page. Always unsigned, always postmarked from somewhere different, but always bearing the same phrase Mother 12 remembers. The black ledger and the 10th name. In 2007, during routine demolition of an adjacent abandoned farmhouse on the edge of the Foing property, one never formally linked to the family contractors unearthed a metal box buried beneath a crumbling stone wall. It contained water-damaged papers, rusted keys, and a small black ledger bound in waxed leather. The ledger, later dubbed the 10th book by local archivists, listed 10 names. 9 of them matched previously known Foing adoptees. But the 10th, name Honora, was unknown to any court record, police file, or adoption report. Honora's name appeared more frequently than any other. Her entry spanned multiple pages, chronicling what appeared to be ritualistic observations. Day 14, resists doctrine. Day 26, scratches at door. Refuses mirror prayer. Day 39, removed to silence. Day 43, failed re-entry. Body rejects communion. There were no further notes. Some pages included symbols later identified by religious scholars as modified Zoroastrian sigils, specifically those associated with purification and fire. Others bore phrases in Latin and Greek stitched together into nonsense invocations. One repeated line appeared near every Honora entry: "The vessel leaks. The vessel leaks. The fire is not pleased." There was no death certificate, no record of an Honora Foing, no grave. But in a locked drawer at the Millbrook County Archive, misfiled for decades, Cooper found a single photograph. A girl with bright, frightened eyes. The back bore no name. Only a date, July 3, 1989. And the words scrawled in Margaret's handwriting. She heard the mirror speak. The final letter from Susan Fletcher. In 2012, 17 years after Susan Fletcher's death, her daughter Emily received a registered parcel addressed in her mother's handwriting. The return label listed a P.O. box in Maine, long since closed. The letter inside was sealed with wax and accompanied by a cassette tape and a key. Susan had left instructions. The tape contained a voice message recorded shortly before her death. Her voice was weak but steady, threaded with a calm finality. "If you're hearing this," she began, "then something remained. And I suspect that something is still watching." She described finding the red journal before it was discovered by Briarcliff staff. She had copied key pages and mailed them to a contact she never named, someone trained in semiotics and ancient liturgies. The contact allegedly confirmed what Susan had long feared. The journal was not madness. It was liturgy. The key, Susan explained, belonged to a lockbox stored beneath the basement tiles of her home in Millbrook, concealed beneath false concrete. Emily, who still owned the house, found it exactly where her mother had said. Inside were 6 pages of translated doctrine taken from Margaret's journal, with annotations pointing to a belief system rooted in ritual sacrifice, linguistic purification, and the spiritual alignment of orphaned vessels. It was Margaret's own scripture. But what shocked Emily most wasn't the content, it was a sketch drawn on the final page. A girl standing alone in front of a mirror, her eyes hollow, her mouth sewn shut with black thread. Below it, Susan had written in red ink, "I saw her once. She looked just like Honora." Emily later confessed that she dreamed of the girl often standing at the edge of her childhood bed, fingers raised mouthing silent words, and sometimes her breath would fog the glass, even when the mirror was cold. The basement door they never opened. Though the house on Hawthorne Road had long since been condemned, a state-sponsored preservation team was granted limited access in 2014 for the purpose of documenting historically significant properties connected to legal precedent. What they found deepened the legend and reopened the case. The team's structural engineer, Alyssa Chan, noticed something odd in the blueprints. The foundation measurements didn't quite add up. According to the plans, the basement should have extended an additional 8 feet east of the visible storage area. But there was no sign of such a space. No door, no crawl space, no sealed entrance. Except the concrete in one corner near the old furnace had a different hue. Newer. Poured later. Someone had covered something. With permission from the Historical Society, they broke the slab. Beneath it lay a rusted metal hatch sealed with a padlock that had been sawed off decades earlier and welded shut. When they finally breached it, the door groaned open, revealing a narrow stairway descending into blackness. The air that spilled out was cold, unnaturally so, and carried the stench of mildew and something older, sharper. Not quite rot, not quite blood. Something mineral and metallic, like old coins held in a sweating palm. At the base of the stairs they found a small stone chamber. The walls were lined with charred wood slats, and at the center stood a stone pedestal. Upon it, a silver mirror cracked across its face and a chair bolted to the floor. Behind the pedestal, someone had scrawled words in black soot across the wall. The vessel must see itself before it can be unmade. Later analysis revealed the room was soundproofed using primitive methods: cotton tar, wax paper insulation. On the floor, faint impressions of shackles remained embedded in the concrete. No records had ever mentioned this room. It wasn't a panic shelter. It was a ritual space. No blood stains, no bones, no photographs. Just a mirror. And the silence. Whispers in foster homes. Across the state, years after the Foing case faded from headlines, caseworkers and foster parents across Pennsylvania began reporting something strange, small but persistent. Children who had been placed from the Millbrook raid were in subtle and disturbing ways connected. Some, like Lily and Joy, had gone into specialized therapeutic homes. Others had been placed with experienced foster families. But even with distance and time, a few odd patterns emerged. One boy began drawing the same spiral symbol over and over again in his journals, even though he'd never been shown it before. The spiral matched one that had appeared in the red journal Margaret kept. A girl who had spoken no words for 2 years whispered one sentence to her foster mother during a thunderstorm. They can still see me through the glass. Another child, placed hundreds of miles away in Erie, Pennsylvania, woke up screaming one night. When asked why, he said, "Gideon told me to close the mirror. He said it's still open." These stories weren't part of any official report. They came up in social worker debriefings, whispered among colleagues, shrugged off as trauma residue. And yet the consistency unnerved those who paid attention. One caseworker, known only as Ms. H, began compiling the incidents into a private file she called the Echo Ledger. She tracked 21 separate children who reported seeing a woman in black near reflective surfaces or hearing a bell in their dreams. No two children were housed in the same county. None had contact with one another, but every single one at some point referred to a figure they called either Mother 12, the lady with no face, or the Watcher. Ms. H tried to bring her concerns to a state supervisor in 2016. She was told to stop. Her files were seized and marked confidential. She left Child Services later that year. No one has heard from her since. The mirror doctrine resurfaces online. In 2019, a private forum on the dark web called The Hollow Wake began posting cryptic religious passages written in a style eerily similar to Margaret Foing's journal. The posts were organized under categories like rites of reflection, the doctrine of stillness, and unseen Anora. At first, it seemed like elaborate fiction, a horror role-playing forum or ARG alternate reality game. But moderators quickly removed anyone who questioned the source of the texts. Access was tightly controlled. Some users claimed to have been invited after participating in mirror-based rituals found in old occult forums. One post stood out, titled Day 43, The Reversal of the Vessel. It detailed a ritual involving isolation fasting, recitation of fire-laced scripture, and finally mirror communion. The process matched entries from Margaret's red journal nearly word for word. Accompanying the text was a photograph, grainy dim but unmistakable. It showed the mirror from the Foing basement. Same shape, same crack, except now someone was standing in front of it, a girl with long dark hair back to the camera. The image's metadata revealed a timestamp July 3, 2019, 30 years to the day after the last known entry about Anora. Investigators could not trace the origin of the post. The server was hosted offshore, routed through dozens of dead-end proxies. But a digital forensics team at a private firm believed the original upload location was within Pennsylvania, possibly Millbrook, possibly closer. The forum vanished weeks later. All archives were wiped, but screenshots survived, passed through encrypted email lists, online ghost hunting communities, and obscure esoteric blogs. The mirror, it seemed, had outlived the Foings. And perhaps so had the doctrine. Return to Hawthorne Road, the documentary that was never aired. In early 2020, a small independent film crew from New York began pre-production on a documentary titled 12 Mouths, The Foing Children of Millbrook. The crew, led by director Elena Marks, had acquired exclusive interviews with former caseworkers, legal aides, and one foster sibling who had grown up with a girl allegedly taken from the Foing home. They were granted limited access to the property at 112 Hawthorne Road, still standing, still sealed. Elena's goal was not just to document the house, but to understand how the system had failed, how a family could raise 12 undocumented children under the public's nose for 15 years. The first 3 days of filming went smoothly. They recorded exterior shots, drone footage, and several interviews in Millbrook's town library. Locals, at first hesitant, began to open up. The town had aged. Few remained who had known the Foings personally, but memories lingered, especially in the elders, particularly about the bell. "You'd hear it some nights," said one man. "Not a church bell. Higher, like a dinner bell, but wrong." On day 4, the team entered the house. They used bolt cutters to remove the last lock on the rear basement door. Cameraman Josh Blass captured the descent, noting the chill, the residual smell of scorched metal. But within minutes of entering the ritual room, the one with the cracked mirror, the audio cut out. The file remained, but the sound was gone. Then the batteries drained. 3 separate rigs fully charged died within seconds of one another. Their backup drives recorded only static. Elena, a skeptic by nature, insisted on continuing. They returned the next morning, but something had changed. The mirror was gone. The bolts in the floor were still present. The soot on the walls undisturbed. But the silver mirror, cracked, ancient, central to the case, had vanished. Security footage showed no break-in. The town had cut power to the building 5 years earlier. No tracks in the dust, no damage to the hatch. Elena shelved the project weeks later. When asked why, she simply said, "Some reflections weren't meant to be shared." The footage remains unreleased. Honora's name found in an unexpected place. In 2021, a retired librarian named Maureen Keene was digitizing old-school rosters from Pennsylvania's defunct children's institutions when she stumbled across an anomaly, a handwritten registry from a state-run orphanage called the Wilcott Home, closed in 1984 due to budget cuts and multiple allegations of neglect. Buried within the 1982 entry log was a name, Honora Keene. She had been admitted at age 4 with no known relatives, no birth certificate, and a single note in the margin silent. Observes, "Does not sleep during observation hours, assigned to room 12. Maureen, unsettled, searched further. Honora's name appeared only 2 more times, once in a disciplinary report for mirror aggression, and once in a transfer document that was never signed. The date of that final entry, July 3, 1984. After that, no record of her exists. No foster placement. No transfer confirmation. The institution closed the following year, and all remaining children were absorbed into the system or returned to shelters. But when Maureen cross-referenced the staff names from that year, she found something chilling. A volunteer listed under religious education named M. Foing. No first name, no employment record, just a signature on one page beside Honora's last entry. Maureen contacted a local archivist who had worked on the Foing case in the 1990s. When shown the record, he turned pale and said that's where she found her. Honora hadn't been born into the Foing household. She had been taken from Wilcott and possibly prepared long before. The final photograph, found in the glass. In 2023, a collector of haunted objects known only online as Archivist of Ash purchased a broken mirror at an estate auction in upstate New York. The mirror had been stored in the barn of a late antique dealer, unlisted in inventory, covered in tarps. It had no frame, just raw edges, cracked in a familiar pattern. Within a week of owning the object, the archivist reported strange behavior in his studio lights, flickering whispered phrases in white noise recordings, and most disturbingly, Polaroids exposed while inside sealed film packs. One image uploaded to a private Discord server shows a grainy reflection in the glass. A girl about 12 standing at an angle, looking down. Her mouth appears to be sewn shut. Behind her, dozens of dark shapes, faceless, watching. The photo was time-stamped. July 3rd, 2023. The archivist attempted to sell the mirror, but buyers backed out. Paranormal investigators who reviewed the image noted a pattern in the dark shapes behind the girl. An outline resembling a wheel, a circle of eyes, 12 spokes. It's not just a haunting, one said. It's a liturgy. Experts in visual forensics attempted to analyze the reflection. They enhanced the photo, sharpened the edges, traced the eye placement. In the very back, barely visible, was another figure. Older, thin, standing just behind the girl, her hand on the girl's shoulder. The facial features were blurry, but the hair, the posture, the eyes, they matched Margaret Foing. She had died in 1996, and yet there she was, in a mirror found over 300 miles from Millbrook, in the same pose described by child witnesses, as if still waiting, still watching, still unmaking, a grave without a name. In the summer of 2024, renovations began on the long-abandoned Millbrook Town Cemetery after a community grant aimed to restore historic burial grounds. During excavation near the northern perimeter, an unmarked section historically reserved for paupers and wards workers uncovered an old stone half-buried and cracked. It bore no name, just a single carving. Beneath the marker was a small coffin, child-sized and largely intact. The wood, though decayed, still bore remnants of paint red on the inside. Lining the coffin's interior was a layer of soot mixed with crushed glass. Resting atop a decayed cloth bundle was an iron key with a jagged edge and a scrap of linen with 4 words stitched in crimson thread she did not return. The town archivist, now well acquainted with the Foing case, recognized the symbol immediately. It had appeared in Margaret's journal in the black ledger found near the orchard and in the red ink annotations on Susan Fletcher's translations. There wasn't a decoration. It was a designation. Theories arose. Was this Honora's grave? A burial meant to symbolically erase her existence, ritually silenced, or was this someone else, a child who had failed the mirror ritual disposed of in secrecy and marked only by the order? DNA analysis was attempted but failed due to environmental degradation. But the shape of the coffin, the soot, the glass, the key, all of it aligned with the doctrine. The grave has since been recovered. A fence was installed, but the townspeople avoid the north side now. The grass never regrows there, and even in the heat of summer the soil remains cold. The unsent. Letters of Margaret Foing. In late 2024, an auction house in Boston listed a private collection of colonial correspondence for sale, inherited from a descendant of the McIntyre family, former caretakers of Briarcliff Restorative Hospital. Among them were letters written by patients and never mailed. Most were mundane ramblings of the sick, forgotten apologies, cryptic farewells. But one set dated between December 1995 and March 1996 was signed Foing, 23 letters in total, each addressed to a different name, to the one with the scar, to the boy who forgot his birthday, to the girl who spoke to mirrors. Each letter opened with a greeting, "My flame, my vessel, my last attempt," and continued with tone alternating between maternal tenderness and surgical detachment. One letter read, "You were the furthest I reached. The light inside you didn't scream when I touched it. I still hear your lullaby in the quiet between bells." Another closed, "The mirror does not lie, only the face that fears it." Some were written entirely in backwards cursive. Others were mirror-written, readable only with reflection. The final letter bore no recipient, only a phrase they have always been listening. Scholars attempted to decode them, suspecting cipher or embedded doctrine, but none agreed on their meaning. The letters remain unpublished, but digital copies circulate. Whispers suggest they weren't letters at all. They were summons. The disappearance of Emily Fletcher. In January 2025, Emily Fletcher, once the most outspoken survivor and whistleblower of the Foing case, vanished from her home in Ithaca, New York. She had been preparing to publish a memoir titled "Mirror Milk My Childhood Inside the Quiet House." She never submitted the manuscript. Security footage showed her leaving her apartment building shortly after midnight, carrying only a single duffel bag and her laptop. She never returned. Her phone was found smashed in a creek 15 miles north. A handwritten note was recovered from her desk. "You cannot reflect what is not there. The mouth must be closed. The child must not remember." Her disappearance drew national attention. Conspiracy forums erupted with speculation. Some believed she'd been silenced by shadowy religious remnants. Others claimed she'd crossed into the mirror threshold described in the Hollow Wake Forum. What unnerved investigators most was what was missing: her bathroom mirror. Gone. The wall behind it scraped, raw nails still embedded. No fingerprints, no DNA, only a single word carved into the plaster. Honora, a town without shadows. By spring 2025, Millbrook had become a ghost of itself. The population dwindled. Businesses closed. Locals cited bad luck, a string of sudden deaths, unexplained fires, and mounting paranoia. But something else began to change. The town grew dimmer. Streetlights flickered and failed. Mirrors in homes cracked without contact. A tourist posted a video on social media claiming his reflection blinked twice while his eyes remained still. The video was removed within hours. A power outage blacked out the town for 3 nights in April. Those who stayed reported a strange quiet, not just silence, but anti-sound. No crickets, no creaks, no breath. And then the shadows. People began reporting that objects didn't cast them anymore. Trees, fences, people standing under the sun left no trace on the ground. Only the Foing house still had shadow. One long, sharp silhouette stretching across the lawn even when the skies were overcast. One resident wrote anonymously online, "There's only one mirror left now. I think it's under us. And I think it's open." The doctrine never ends. As of mid-2025, the Foing case remains technically closed. No new arrests, no convictions, no official mention of ritual abuse, religious indoctrination, or esoteric theology ever made it into court records. But the story never ended, because the doctrine never required belief, only reflection. It wasn't a cult in the traditional sense. It was a mirror, a system designed to erase identity, rewrite the soul, and remove children from the continuity of memory itself. Not by killing them, but by unmaking them. In the last line of Susan Fletcher's translated notes, dated just weeks before her death, she wrote, "The mirror is not a portal. It is a commandment. It demands nothing but silence. It reflects only the obedient, and across dark forums, encrypted messages, and the disappearing edges of rural America, the symbol reappears. It marks street signs. It appears on chalkboards. It flashes for a single frame in corrupted live streams. A vessel, an eye, a doctrine, not gone, only waiting, because Margaret Foing may be dead, but the mirror doctrine never needed her to live.